So, Joel, you've got enormous wealth of experience in running big teams and working at all sorts of levels within organisations throughout your career. If there was one thing from a leadership perspective that you think might be valuable to our listeners today, from your experience, what might that be?
It's the realisation that whether it's in your work life or your personal life, whatever happens to you, whatever event happens to you, nobody can take away your ability to choose how you want to feel about that and how you want to respond to that. You can always own that, take the ownership for personal choice.
Hello, our guest today is Joel Mitchell, Managing Director of Stagecoach South East, part of one of the biggest public transport companies in the UK. With a fleet of 350 buses and 1,300 staff, his team's responsible for 40 million passenger journeys a year. Joel's experience includes operations, performance and customer services. He holds a master's degree in leadership and is a qualified coach and mentor. With a wealth of experience at every level within large organisations, he knows a thing or two about leading frontline teams in highly operational businesses. He's also been through some tough times, and he uses these personal experiences to motivate his team to face their challenges with resilience and kindness. I'm Robert Diggins, and this is Highly Relational, the podcast about creating, leading and developing great teams at work, along with all the possibilities and messiness of enabling and inspiring people to work together. We have one simple aim: to help you create exceptional teams with the people you work with or the people you lead. In our conversation today, Joel explains that your brain is not you and your thoughts are not you, and how to figure out who you truly are. Why you must have a version of yourself that exists even after you've taken off all your coats, your leadership coat, your friend coat, your parent coat, and how therapy and coaching can lead to a greater understanding of yourself and the people you lead. Leadership can take countless forms. For some, being a leader means being at the forefront, being the driving force that keeps everyone moving. For others, leadership is about guiding from the sidelines or even from behind, empowering others to take the lead, to shine and grow, and so become inspiring leaders themselves. Joel's approach to leadership is rooted in a genuine desire to understand and connect with his team, creating a culture where leaders emerge and everyone is valued. He's also a big believer in the importance of self-awareness, how we must overcome our ego and transition from an I to a we mentality. I began our conversation by asking Joel how his self-identity has changed over the years.
It's changed a lot. It comes from awareness, I think, really, in terms of me as a person and learning a bit more about humanity and society as I've gone along in my own kind of career and life, really. So now I'm 47 now. I've had good bit of time in the workplace, and I've learned a bit more about me, I think, and ego, and how over-identification or identification with role can detrimentally impact your ability to carry out that role. From my own perspective, I think what I would describe as a kind of maladjusted schema, as I've learned it's now called over the years, formed in childhood, informed my desire to really please people, which is great if you're passionate about customer service and you work in the transport industry, because within the transport industry sector in particular, it is working with people for people. So if you are people-centric, that's great. If you want to please people, that's great. But at some point, a realization came in me that it was self-serving. So the need to please was driven by an internal desire for acceptance and validation, which again, if you're aware, isn't the end of the world, provided you are not making decisions in the boardroom for the sake of harmony, rather than what's the right thing to do in this context for this organisation for long-term sustainability. I've got this colleague in front of me who needs something and I want to fulfil that need because I want them to be happy. And actually going around and saying yes to 1,500 people individually won't necessarily honour or bless your leadership team or the people that you've said yes to, because it might be outside the context of the organisational aims or your strategic plan. And so it's about being much more aware about who you are, what you're bringing to that role, and what your whole kind of point is and your purpose is. And I think if you can line up behind a value set that is about truth and love and isn't out with that, and you can be aware of when your ego's in play or you are just showing up as you, then you'll be much more effective in the world, let alone in your job.
And I think it takes an enormous amount of work to say what you've just said, an enormous amount of personal work, to see how our ego constructs can be very much self-serving, of course, from a survival point of view, and that they can be created through our early experience. So I imagine that's been quite a journey for you to get to the place where you can talk about that in the way you just have.
Yeah, I mean, it really has. And quite a lot of it is recent over the last couple of years. So I think probably on my own personal learning journey, the vast majority of the richness has appeared or kind of crystallized for me over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, through some really great things like having super amount of therapy, which I would highly recommend to everybody, regardless of your own kind of sense of self at the minute. It's just great to be able to understand a bit more. I'd like to add that I'm not necessarily very good at it yet. There's a difference between understanding and applying it. And from my perspective, being aware of a kind of a fast-paced nature, I don't often give myself space to stop and think about, is this me at the minute or is this ego-based? Am I over-identifying with something, which is generally the construct of ego? It's a over-identification with a role or thought patterns, and that can then create the wrong decision-making criteria in your mind in that moment. So it's really hard work when you're busy and there's a lot going on and you're trying to make decisions, to stop and be mindful for a moment and ask yourself, right, is this thought me or is it my brain? Because actually my brain isn't me and my thoughts aren't me, and my brain often isn't my friend either. And that realizing that your thoughts aren't you and your brain isn't you, but you are the entity that realizes that, is quite a complicated and complex mindset anyway. To remind yourself that that's actually what you've learned, stop for a minute, pause, go back to the discussion that you're having, trying to work out, are you doing this to self-serve or is it for the greater good? It's very complicated, very time-consuming. I'm not very good at it, but I'm very glad I know about it.
You're here today. We've never met before.
No.
You're here today because of a LinkedIn post that you wrote a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
I won't read the whole thing because it's in the public domain, and anybody interested could have a look at it for themselves. I reread it, Joel, on the train in this morning, and it moved me to tears. It is an extraordinary. I mean, for you, you may think, well, no, I'll just bash that out and it's nothing. But for me, it was an extraordinary bit of self-disclosure. It starts with you saying, here are some thoughts on a Saturday evening as I reflect on one of the most challenging weeks I've faced in my career. And for me, the post is full of contradiction and paradox, and because of that, I know it's full of great wisdom, which is why I find it so inspiring. I'll get you to say a little bit about why the week was so challenging, but then you generously offer 4 possible learnings that you hope will be useful to those in your network. One is about having some therapy, which you've already talked about, and how that has been so important to your mental health. The second learning you had from this very challenging week was about checking in with feelings and about naming the feelings that we have as we're having them. Your third point was the importance of self-care and looking after ourselves by being with loved ones or going for a bike ride, you suggest, or just getting outside. And then lastly, you talk about this over-identifying with our ego or our patterning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, because you've got a lovely metaphor to do with wearing different coats that represent different roles. Tell me a little bit about where you were at the end of that week that led you to write this post for your network.
So I think in that moment, I was reflective because I'd done a bit of self-care and I'd just come back in off my bike. And I used to do a lot of running, but I'm getting a bit older now and I keep breaking. So I'd got my bike mended and I'd been out, and my fiance had encouraged me to go out because she's very good at sensing quicker than where I am at. She's brilliant for me in that way because she will challenge me and let me know if my ego's flaring up in a really good way. And then so I'd come back in and I'd been reflecting on the bike ride. And I mean, there's quite a long story to it really, Robert, in the end, but I joined the bus industry. I left 20 years of a very happy railway career to join the bus industry because I found something online when I was considering whether to take the job or not, called The Value of Bus to Society by an organisation called Greener Journeys, and a lady called Claire Haig had written it. And my childhood was very much informed by my mum and dad being Christian evangelists. That we lived in Fiji for a few years while they worked out there in churches. So I've kind of got a conditioning around being a bit missional and wanting to do the right thing for society. And that is within me. And it's probably, we'll unpack it later, around ego and conditioning and childhood. But I took this job because I wanted to be able to look after people and communities. And the organisation, I live in the community that we're serving. I wanted to grow bus use. I wanted to get more people on the bus. It's the right thing for the environment. It's the right thing for society. It's the right thing for the economy. And I believe in all of that. So, and to find myself in a position where, because of the pandemic and because of bus use and because I have to maintain sustainability, or I can't do any of those things longer term, and re-baselining, it was absolutely the right thing to do. But on the Friday, I'd been called to just a village hall in a village not far from where I live that we serve. And when I got there, I thought something else was going on because I couldn't get in. Couldn't park, I couldn't get in the hall, and I thought it was a changeover between what had gone on before and what was happening now. But it wasn't. It was just the entire village had turned up in protest of the changes that we'd publicised or certainly consulted for their bus network. I stood there at the front. My colleague, Danny, our ops director, came with me for moral support. Another colleague of mine, Danny, was also there because he lived in the village and he'd been very supportive. But I stood in the front and I listened for a couple of hours to trauma, distress, suffering, a story from a lady on the front row who was pregnant and blind and wasn't able to access the local hospital because the bus service that we'd proposed wasn't going to be fit for purpose, but she couldn't drive. She couldn't get to her maternity checks. She couldn't get to her eye appointments. And and Danny said, actually, you did really well and you held yourself well and you explained the context because, I think people understand there's no desire for this to happen. We're not desperately trying to remove buses from the road. So when I got home from the session, I just felt had it because I like people to be happy and I am making people unhappy. So from a over-identification with the role as managing director, responsible for looking after that community, I feel like I'm failing. I felt like I'm failing from a context of me as a human, what I line up behind in my own value sets. I felt like I'd let them down. And from a context of my own sense of what matters to the world, I didn't feel like I was doing that either, certainly in the short term. And I'm very fortunate that the learnings I've had more recently helped me to realise that I was reflecting and over-identifying too much with myself. So if you've got an intersection of self in a Venn diagram and an intersection of role in a Venn diagram, those two things had really kind of overlapped. So I felt like me, Joel, this guy, this entity, whatever I am, wasn't good enough, wasn't showing up in the way I wanted to, hadn't delivered for people. People weren't happy and I want to make people happy. So,
and what you're describing, I know that many people listening to us today will have their own version of those kinds of deep inner conflicts. But the easier route, of course, is to numb that feeling in some way or distract away from it. And what I am interested in understanding is how you processed it, because I think you did it in a significantly harder but potentially much wiser way.
Yeah. So I got myself into the thought pattern of let down. So I was identifying with my thoughts. My brain was talking to me. My brain was saying, "You've let these people down. This isn't this isn't okay." But I acknowledged that thought pattern I didn't want to identify with, and it was egoic. It wasn't within the context of what really mattered from a longer term. As it was, we were able to reflect and change and deliver for those people in the right way because we gave it more time and we thought slightly differently and we were a bit more innovative, which is great because it was a catalyst for a business choice there. But I was able to come to that solution with my team because I was free from the negative thoughts that I was letting rule my choices. So I was clear from shame and pain and suffering because I knew that I wasn't right to identify with what my head was telling me. My head was telling me, you've let them down, you're no good, you're a baddie, this isn't what you signed up for.
And some would say, to stay with the theme of ego, that is your superego, that's your inner critic ripping you apart for what it somehow believes is the way you should be in the world. And what I think you're telling us that you were able to disidentify from that,
exactly,
and see the situation from a much bigger perspective.
Exactly that. So a recent learning for me is that my thoughts aren't me. Fundamentally, my thoughts are not me. My brain isn't me, and sometimes it isn't my friend either.
So, Joel, can I ask you a really tricky metaphysical question? Because I'm so interested in where you might go with it. And that is, so what is you, or who are you? Which some would say is the most fundamental question we can ask ourselves, because it points to something other than our brains or our egos or our superegos. So can you speak to that, or is that tricky to capture? Who are you then, Joel, if you're not those things?
So I'm nearly there with this now. It's taken a long time. And if anybody's interested, a guy called Eckhart Tolle, who wrote a book called The Power of Now, is quite helpful in this space. But for me, if you are not your thoughts and your brain, what you are is the entity that realizes that. So one of Tolle's stories is really interesting, and it can be a bit inflammatory. But what Tolle says is, if you walk down the street and there's somebody walking the other way or crosses your path and they're talking to themselves, muttering to themselves, people will look at them and think that person's not okay. They might be mad. Yet we spend most of our lives talking to ourselves. The only difference between us and that person we've just decided is mad is that we're not verbalizing those thoughts. We're listening to them and we're probably acting on them. But essentially the same question I've been having a dilemma with. So if I'm not my thoughts and my identification with my thoughts, or my role, or my physical form, then what am I? And my recent learning is that I am the entity that realizes that. My consciousness realizes that. So if you can hear what your brain's saying to you and stop for a minute and be aware enough to say, I'm not sure that's all right, actually. I don't think I sign up to what you're saying to me today, brain. So I'm just going to reject that thought pattern today. That's you. That's it. That's who I am. It's the awareness.
Let's go back to this idea of roles and coats, which was your last piece of learning in the LinkedIn post that I saw. Tell us what you mean by that and why it was important to you to share it.
This meant a lot to me, and it wasn't something I made up. This is another piece of learning, which generally is how my life has played out. I've learned stuff and tried to apply it as I've gone. The coats analogy is really powerful. It's basically saying, don't over-identify with any one of the roles that you've got in your life, because you aren't that role. Do not over-identify with anything, because it isn't you. It's just one of the things that you play, you act out in life. I remember really clearly, my son Jasper is 14, and I remember reading him, it actually makes me really emotional. I remember reading him a story when he was about 3 or 4, and getting to the end of the book, and I hadn't been on my phone, and I wasn't doing that kind of busy, but I absolutely wasn't aware. And I remember a realization. I got to the end of the book and I couldn't remember a word that I'd read him. I'd read him the whole book, and he didn't know. Well, actually, probably did pick it up in the psyche. But I'd managed to fulfill the role of father, but I'd been thinking about the role of what my job was at the time. So this is about being present to the thing that you are doing in that moment, learning one, and also recognizing that your authentic self comes to all of those roles. And the coats are a really helpful analogy. So I've got a managing director of a bus company coat. I've got a fiance coat, I've got a dad coat, I've got a stepdad coat. I've got a joke, and he said rubbish cricketer coat. I'm awful at cricket, but I enjoy it, and I'm enjoying being part of a team. But I work really hard not to wear any of the coats at the same time, because, as I said, you get hot doing that. And also, if you wear too many of the coats for too long, it will get dog-eared and tired. And then the final learning in that is and this was really nice about the ego, really good learning in terms of that, is you asked me earlier, who are you if you're not your thoughts or your identification with any of those coats? When you take every single coat off, name everything you do in life, friend, husband, partner, wife, name them all, take all those coats off, you are what's left.
So where I'd like to take this now is to the leadership role. How does all that you've just told us about the personal work that you're doing and have done on yourself to arrive at the conclusion that you are your consciousness, which on one level might sound very esoteric or metaphysical, and on another is perhaps just a very simple expression of the truth of the human condition. What does that mean about how you lead? And our conversation today is oriented around teams and how teams function and how we create the environment for people to work together in exceptional and remarkable ways.
So it's very different for me just recently. Over the last couple of years, things have changed fundamentally. They've changed very much in my personal life. I'm in a much better place, thanks to my family structure. The learning from the therapy has been huge, and being able to apply that in the workplace has meant, I guess, for me, a fundamental shift in my own style. So colleagues that have worked with me in the past, and some of them will be listening to this, and I hope they find this helpful because I've met some wonderful, wonderful people throughout my career, will probably recognise me as someone that is a nice guy. One of the things that I really like to espouse in a leadership construct is kindness, not in a weak, softly way. Although I think in my early career, I remember being the driver depot manager at Wimbledon Park, and my colleagues there, the drivers there, who I loved. It was probably my favourite job, other than the one I've currently got. Used to call me the man from Del Monte, because you'd ask Joel for something and he would say yes, which I'm pretty sure my boss at the time, who was also excellent, liked to a point, but would wish I didn't say yes to everybody. And I'd started going through a coaching journey at that time as well. And my coach and I were trying to develop more of a rigor and a strictness around results delivery. Because I've always had the kind of philosophy that if you look after the people, then the results will follow. And I stand by that. That has never changed for me. And our 5-year strategic plan is called People at the Heart, which in my current role, which is about looking after your colleagues so they look after the customers and the community. People first, colleagues first, customer, community. And we talked about my kind of own narrative being rigorous focus on people and a rigorous focus on results, which is pretty cool. And I sort of signed up to that while still hiding behind the fact that I really liked rigorous focus on people, and sort of pretended that I did the other bit, but didn't really. And I think what has changed for me in the recognition of where this ego and the suboptimal schema, personality deficiencies, if you like. I want to be critical, and I don't want other people to think, oh no, I don't really agree with what Joel was saying there. We arrive in this world without any conditioning, and then our experiences form us as we go, and our ego emerges based on our experiences and some other bits and pieces that I haven't got my head around yet, but generally what you've experienced. And that will show up if you're not mindful about whether you choose it to or not. Viktor Frankl said something that I read. He came across a concept that he termed the last of the human freedoms, which is the concept that, as I said at the start, no matter what happens to you, nobody can take away your power to choose your attitude, your own way, not in a kind of petulant way.
And Frankl had That insight in Nazi
he did in a concentration
camps,
camp, yeah,
where he realised that no matter what was being done to him and the people there physically, he had sole choice about his own internal process.
Exactly that.
And he went on to develop a form of psychotherapy based on that. And many people will have read about his work. And remind me what the title is of that of his main book. Is it Man's Search for Meaning?
Yeah, and it's I think for me, and a lot of the personal challenges I've had in work and my personal life, I've watched that emerge, and I will talk a little bit about that later if there's the opportunity to. But so back into the context in the leadership space in the workplace, it's the realization that a rigorous focus on people is great within a context, and but you need to do it from a place of sincerity and make sure it's behind the strategic aims of the business, and you're not just happening to be doing it because it's your hobby, or worse still, it's a maladjusted schema that you've used as a coping mechanism in the past, and it looks outwardly like a really good thing to have, but often it can be starting to damage the organization. So for me, over time, the realization of that has helped me to really ramp up the focus on results whilst not losing the focus on people, because that's inherent in me. But what I really needed to focus on was the rigor around KPI delivery, measures, management information, management, to the point where now my own narrative is basically a rigorous focus on results. I went from rigorous focus on people, rigorous focus on results, to rigorous focus on people, rigorous focus on results, to rigorous focus on results, rigorous focus on people. Now it's just rigorous focus on results. The people stuff is inherent.
So you're saying now that you have transitioned to now focusing on results, but baked into that because of who you are and the personal journey and development journey you've been on, the rigorous focus on people is built in.
Absolutely that.
It's hardwired into the way you lead, and therefore doesn't need to be named.
Exactly right. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I don't want anybody to think for a minute I've decided not to care about people anymore. Quite the opposite. It's so ingrained in who I am as a human, in my own construct, sense of self, authentic self, or whatever you want to term it, that I'm really comfortable to not have to name it as part of my own kind of strategic narrative, which sounds a bit kind of management speaky, but yeah, I think that makes the point really nicely.
And that is very, very different, of course, to a rigorous focus on results that ignores the people that are involved. They are like chalk and cheese, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think, again, a lot of my own personal learnings has been around leadership versus management, from a kind of academic level, and early on in my sort of leadership career, I would talk a lot about leadership, really aspire to be a great leader. I was one of those. I remember some of my colleagues, I left South West Trains when I worked for Southern for a bit, and then had a period of time on gardening leave in between returning, and I read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which meant a lot to me. But I came back it's a great book, but I came back into South West Trains where I'd been before. I had three very happy years at Southern, came back to South West Trains in a deep alliance role, which was brilliant because it was connected and collaborative and full system and lots of other kind of management stuff that I'd really got excited about. But I was overly evangelical about this book I'd read, and immediately got my really close mates, some of whom I'm still great mates with, would be like, here he comes with his evangelizing again, please stop it. But there was such richness in learning around the need for management in my world. When I did my master's, one of the things I learned, was leadership is an essentially contested concept. Go and ask anybody how to define leadership, they'll all give you a different answer. And that both leadership and management are absolutely critical to be successful in a, whatever you want to call it. Leadership, management, you can use those terms interchangeably. But for me, leadership is about people, management is about task, and you have to be strong at both of those if you want to be successful in a big leadership type role, and you have to be able to focus on both of those. And well-balanced people will be able to kind of naturally focus on both. And individuals, and this is where my own journey comes in, the way that I lived my life when I was a child meant that humanity rightly had a huge space, but I probably, when I came into the workplace, didn't really give credit to the need for task structure. So leadership without management can be chaotic and arguably dangerous, and management without leadership can be obtuse and boring and lack heart and inspiration. And I should also caveat that everything we're talking about today, all right, is my subjective view of the world. It's how I see the world through my frame of reference. And if it's helpful for some people, brilliant. It won't be for everybody. But this is kind of how my paradigm has shifted. So my scratched glass lens that I looked at through the world is seeing things a bit differently now.
Yeah, and I'm really appreciating, and I know our listeners will be too, the clarity with which you're articulating your personal process and how things have changed for you and why they've changed and the meaning that you're making of it. Because at the end of the day, that's all any of us have got. We're all making it up as we go along.
Yeah, exactly that.
The question is, how are we making it up, and what is the history of that making up, and what choice do we have about it?
Yeah.
Bring us back to your team and how these orientations that you now have on a I'd be really keen to understand something of how this plays out on a day-to-day basis with the people in the exec team that you lead, and then in the cascading that into the wider business if you've attempted to do that. But talk about the exec team that you lead as managing director. What are some of the changes? What are the consequences of these insights that you're telling us about?
I think there's a closeness in that unit that I really appreciate. So for a start, I think if you're leading anybody, you have kind of two jobs there. One is you're leading the team for the organisational vision, and two is you've got a responsibility to those individuals as their leader to try and help them have better lives or have more insight or try and understand a bit more about where they are in the world. And just little things just recently have shifted. So we do a bit of team development as a group. Ironically, probably initially for cost pressures, instead of doing our sort of more traditional overnighter at the local hotel with our consultant leadership development specialist, who I've learned a lot from over the years, I was worried about, some of the challenges we were facing financially, the financial pressures, trying to find some other ways of doing things. So we actually went glamping as a unit because it was much, much cheaper. And my goodness, the richness that we got from being in the outside for a start. I remember you referred back to one of those learnings that I wrote on the LinkedIn post, was kind of get outside, experience nature. And, even the subtle differences about being in a hotel, going back to your room. I mean, colleagues listening to this will have done lots of different leadership stuff and taken value from it. Once you've finished in your team room, you then go back to your individual room. You probably check your emails, you get on your phone, catch up during the day. And then you'll go down to the restaurant and then maybe have a beer afterwards and a game of cards and a chat. And it's really great. It is enhancing. But my goodness, not having any signal. We told the team that we were out of reach and how to contact if there's something happened. And then there just was no break between being as a unit. And it was amazing. And there is a closeness in that unit. So I think developing genuine, authentic relationships, human connections really matters in a leadership team. Not everybody subscribes to that, and I understand that it isn't for everybody, but it works for me and the teams that I've been a part of and also led. So this isn't just a Joel kind of leadership philosophy. I know that I've become a much more effective leader when I feel part of a community of practice or part of a family or part of a group of people that genuinely care about each other as humans, not just the organisational aims of the business. Ironically, there's a definite link to improved organisational outcomes if you can build that proper skin in the game. And picking the right people and having diversity in your team and different skill sets and different personality bases. And we do a lot of the insights work in our team. There's there's a lot of that's very strong within Stagecoach, and I've always appreciated that we could do that internally too. So from a team perspective, I'm not sure this team would have survived for the difficult challenges we're facing at the minute if we weren't as tight a unit as we are.
How did you get? I'm really curious about the just this description of this offsite, the glamping. How long was that you were in?
Just 2 days.
2 days. Great.
Yeah.
So one night
overnight.
under canvas, and 2 days together. Where I'm putting words in your mouth slightly, but it sounds to me like you came together as a community, and it wasn't this. Let's go off. There's an hour now, and you can go back to your room and do your email. It was a thing that happened for 48 hours, and you were all in it, kind of all the time.
Yeah.
How did you get your team? I mean, this may not be a relevant question, but I can imagine people listening to this going, well, even if I wanted to do that, there are 3 people on my team who I would not be able to agree to that experience because it's too much for them. It would be outside of what they considered or felt was a normal thing to do at work. So tell us something about how that was for your team that you were suggesting this, and were they all just totally up for that and saw that as an obvious thing to do together, or was that something that you had to negotiate and explain?
I think a few years ago we wouldn't have been able to. I think the team has come together through some difficult challenges that has built that richness of relationship already to a point. But equally, there was a bit of negotiation. So myself and my colleague who were pulling the day together, the 2 days together, because this wasn't just an offsite to have a jolly. We've got some serious strategic changes that we need to make, and to get away from the challenge of the workplace, I would recommend to anybody for that clarity and that space to breathe, think. Equally, we weren't going to camp because I wouldn't have been able to convince people to do that. So the glamping was a compromise already. Everybody, logistical things like I wouldn't have expected anybody to share accommodation, so everybody would have their own hut, which is what we did, and explaining to people beforehand that was the case and this is what was happening, and sharing the site, plans of the site, photos of what people could expect. And I'm really proud of them because actually, there's a couple of my colleagues in that team who didn't immediately think, oh, this is a great idea. Most of them, oh no, what's he up to now? But even little learnings like the last couple of executives we've had, we've downloaded the Headspace app, and we start our exec meetings with just 3 minutes of mindfulness, just to get us into that place that we were when we experienced being together in the outside. And other colleagues, and there'll be some of our frontline staff listening to this might be thinking, my goodness, this isn't what is needed. It is absolutely what is needed. That clarity and that peace and that stillness to face the challenges ahead is fundamental. If you're in the heat of the battle and it's fast-paced and in a bit of crisis, I would firmly recommend from my own learnings that you find the stillness first to make those grounded choices.
Yeah, so let's just explore that a bit. What do you believe all of this delivers for the business? Because you've said now that you're focused on results because the human, the people side is baked in. So what does this deliver for the business from a results perspective that you believe if you did it the normal way, you wouldn't be able to achieve, or you wouldn't do it so quickly, or whatever the benefits are?
Yeah, okay. I think the rigorous focus on people, rigorous focus on results, into focus on results and people is about me personally. So our 5-year plan, People at the Heart, remains all about people. So everyone else, I just don't need to over enthuse from my own perspective. We need to get the balance right and keep driving people through the organisation. But at an executive team level, Robert, what this kind of thing does is drives us to what I'd call a culture of we. So a culture of interdependence. And, people might listen to this, they might be recognising that there's a racket in my head that's a mix of kind of academic stuff that I learned, there's a bit of experiential stuff that I've learned, and I'm trying to sort of row through it all. But one of the things that really struck a chord with me. And in fact, we've got a piece of work in the team called Culture of We, which is all about strategic change on how people feel about working in this organisation. Stems from a piece that I read with Stephen Covey's book, actually, which is about this thing called the maturity continuum, which comes back to personal choice, which comes back to your ability to choose. So the theory states that you work through 3 levels. So as a child, you are what's called dependent. And your mood and how you show up is very much dependent on what other people do. So you've done this to me and I feel this way. There's no acknowledgement that I can choose how I want to feel. I don't have to choose. I don't give you all my power to make me feel anything. I'm in charge of me. So it's very much you didn't come in for me. You haven't given me this. You said that to me and I feel sad. You. And that's basically a construct of in a child frame of mind. But a lot of humanity don't get the opportunity or the insight or the learning to shift past that. The next stage is called independent, which is a culture of I. I'm responsible for me. I take personal responsibility. I can choose. And then the final stage, the real strength of the maturity continuum, is that culture of we. And that is what's termed interdependent. And that is when we come together, we can do this, we own the decisions, we are better as a group than we are as any individual part of our team. One of the strategic elements we try and do on those away days is, just to narrate it better, is we're not individual laptops, we're a supercomputer. We all plug into the central server and the power of us collectively is much stronger than any one element of it. And the final bit on that theory is that you cannot reach interdependence, the culture of we, until you've got a personal mastery of your own independence. So you can't go from you to we. You've got to get through I first. And
bizarrely, that could, and another analogy could be that is actually to do with the development of ego. And there are theories that you can't let go of ego until you've got a really strong one, because if you attempt it too early, you can psychologically fragment or split. So this is the thing for me around the paradox and the contradiction. It is so interesting. Yeah. You're saying that it's not possible in that maturity curve idea to go from the you to the we.
Correct.
You've got to go through I. So just complete that thought for us around what that might look like.
So again, for me, that becomes the awareness of how you are showing up, how you are feeling, and the personal responsibility for choosing how you want to feel. Mm-hmm. So again, anything can happen to you, but you can own how you want to feel about that. You know, there's John, who runs our leadership development stuff, talks about the wheel of reality, which is the first thing that happens is you notice something, then you think about it because you've noticed it. It drives a thought pattern in your head. The way you think about it will affect how you feel about it, and how you feel about it will affect how you act. And then you create the event and it goes round and round and round again. And at some point you have to almost triage or cut into the bit about think. So you notice something and then you think. And that, for me, is the taking personal responsibility, moving to I, because your brain's saying something to you and you can step away and say to your brain, oh no, I don't actually. Just because it happened last time doesn't mean it's going to happen this time. Or just because I'm fearful for that future outcome doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I need to stop and breathe and think, okay, that happened in my childhood. I see the world that way, but I'm not right. I am just a construct of my experiences. So I need to just stop and listen. And one of the other things in that is one of Covey's habits, which is seek to understand before being understood. Because if you think you know the answer, that is almost certainly your ego talking. And if you start defending your position till the end of time, that isn't you. That is your identification with your assumption. And one of the ways to break that is to really, really listen. And I'm not very good at it, so it costs me. It costs me energy and time, and I need to do more of it. But one of the great ways to do it is I try and imagine there's a pot in the middle of the table if you're sat around a boardroom or if you're in a meeting room. And you want to fill up that pot with everybody's way they see the world. Because what's really interesting is when you look at that data set in the pot in the middle of the room that everyone's chucked into, suddenly your own view of the world has changed fundamentally because you will have just learned something. I mean, a good example for me is if somebody asks me, this is how I learned this theory myself. If somebody asks me about school, I have a view on secondary school. And I had a really horrible start at secondary school. I was really badly bullied at my first secondary school. Tried it for about a year. My parents took me out, and then I went to a different school, which again I didn't really fit in at because it wasn't part of my social background, and I enjoyed it better. But I was always an outlier. So I was an outlier at the first school. I was an outlier at the second school. So if somebody says to me, "What do you think on secondary school education?" I will tell them, but I'm not telling them the truth. I'm not telling them about secondary school education. What I'm telling them is about me. And what I realized that I found through my course of my own learnings is anything I think is just a description of me. It's not a description of the thing I'm talking about. I'm telling people my story. And actually what's really helpful is when you hear theirs as well, because suddenly your own view of the world changes, and that's where the paradigm shift comes.
But that's also where the maturity and the wisdom lies in you, in being open to that. And I know and others listening will know how hard that is, and the amount of, again, I say it again, the amount of work that you've done to get to the place where you can tell us these things in the kind of simplicity and clarity that you are. We are running out of time, Joel. I so appreciate you coming in and sharing some of these things.
So welcome.
Quite extraordinary for me to hear somebody at such a senior level within such a big corporate organisation speaking in the way that you are about the things that are important to you and what you've learned. For those listening, what could you suggest, or what ideas could you offer, how somebody who's listened to you today goes, actually, I may not understand all that Joel has said, but I'm really interested in perhaps attempting to put that into action with my leadership team, or for the consultants and coaches listening, how they might work with a team in a way that just embraces some of the things that you've shared with us today. What might that look like?
Firstly, don't beat yourself up, because I might sound like I've had some really good self-discovery here, and I have, but practical application of learning in life is really, really hard. And I get it wrong again and again and again. But if you can reflect and learn, then wonderful. Keep growing, continuous improvement on your own sense of self. From a practical application in the workplace, we've got this brilliant little sum that John taught us. And in fact, we've been using this in different workplaces and contexts for years. And it is E equals T times R. And people that have worked with me in the past will either be going, yeah, wicked, or rolling their eyes at me going on about it again. But it's a simple sum that says your effectiveness as a leader in the workplace is a simple sum of how well you do your tasks out of 10 multiplied by how well you build authentic relationships out of 10. And if you do that, if you think about that a lot, either in exec meetings as an individual or as a team, you will find quite quickly that you are probably not as effective as you could be. Certainly the example being if you're cracking at getting stuff done, you've got some really good project plans, you've got some APMP qualified people in your team, you've got super Gantt charts, you do your free flow, you're getting stuff over the line, benefit realization, wonderful. But in the meantime, you're leaving a trail of distressed souls in your wake. You can probably give yourself an 8 out of 10 for task and maybe a 3 out of 10 for relationship. And you'll find that 8 times 3 doesn't make you very effective. So you've really got to dial that up. And it comes all the way back to what we said at the beginning. You've got to be strong at management, which is task. You've got to be strong at leadership, which for me is relationship. Have a real good go at developing IQ. Have a real good go at developing EQ. Don't leave one out at the expense of the others. If you're going to leave one out, leave the IQ out, because one of the things I learned on my master's is that emotional intelligence is what is called a meta ability, which it means that you use that to bring the best for your IQ. So if you've got high IQ and low EQ, then actually you're much better off the other way around, arguably, says the theory. So there's some takeaways.
Joel, it's been a privilege to talk to you today. I really very much appreciate you coming in and talking to us. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for asking me.
The you to I to we, Joel Mitchell. Thank you so much for coming in to see us today. You've been listening to Highly Relational. Check out our show notes for more information about today's guest and the topics covered. And if you're enjoying these conversations and getting value from them, do please give us a like or rate wherever you're listening or watching. And of course, there's no better way to support what we're doing than by subscribing. I'd like to thank today's studio manager at VoxPod, Alex Bennett. Our researcher is Ella Halsell, and the series producer is Ollie Guiu. I'm Robert Diggins. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.